That day with my professor was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, something I never saw coming. It happened just a few weeks ago, after the final bell rang. With the other students gone, the classroom felt unnervingly silent, the only sounds being the slow creak of the ceiling fan and the occasional scrape of a chair across the floor. I sat at my desk, my worksheet in front of me, but the faint pencil smudges blurred together as my focus drifted. Inevitably, my eyes landed on Professor Carter. He was at his desk, leaning slightly forward as he graded assignments with a level of concentration that made him oblivious to everything else. His tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms that seemed incongruously strong for someone who spent most of his time lecturing about history. My stomach tightened at the sight, and I quickly looked back down, realizing I'd been staring too long. I normally didn't stay after class. The few students who had lingered earlier had left 10 minutes ago, leaving just the two of us. I told myself I was here to finish my assignment, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Still working on that? His voice cut through the silence, smooth and steady, pulling my attention back to him. Yeah, I replied quickly, sitting up straighter. Just a couple more questions. He smiled faintly, setting his pen down and leaning back in his chair. You're one of the few students who actually takes this seriously, he said, his tone a mix of amusement and admiration. I felt my cheeks heat at the compliment. I guess I just don't want to fall behind, I said, shrugging it off as if it wasn't a big deal. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. That's a good habit, he mused. Most people don't realize how much their choices now shape their future. Something about the way he said it, so earnest, so intent, made my chest tighten. I gave him a small smile before turning back to my worksheet, though my mind was too scattered to focus on the words in front of me. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the scratch of my pencil and the soft rustle of papers as he worked through his stack of assignments. Then, after a moment, he stood, stretching. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound jarring in the quiet. I'll be right back, he said. Okay, I murmured, my voice softer than I intended. I watched him walk toward the door, his movements unhurried, confident in a way that made it impossible to look away. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Alone now, the silence seemed louder. I tapped my pencil against the desk, my thoughts racing. Why did my chest feel so tight? Why did my pulse quicken every time he spoke to me? I'd always admired Professor Carter. He had a way of making history feel alive, his voice naturally captivating. But this was something else. The door opened again, and he stepped back inside, his expression calm as he returned to his desk. You're awfully quiet today, he remarked after a moment, his tone light but curious. I guess I'm just focused, I replied, forcing a small smile. Good, he said, though something in his voice made my stomach twist. Focus is important. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me again. You don't usually stay this late, he noted, almost as if he were thinking aloud. I shrugged, keeping my tone as casual as I could. I just wanted to get this done. He nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful, as if trying to figure something out. You know, he said after a pause, you can always come to me if you need help with anything. The offer felt heavier than it should have. His words lingered in the air like an unspoken promise. I swallowed hard. Thanks, I murmured, barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, his gaze steady on mine before he turned back to his work. The room fell quiet again, but the tension lingered. When I finally finished the assignment, I gathered my things and stood, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I'll see you tomorrow, I said, slinging my bag over my shoulder. Take care, he replied, his voice warm but unreadable. As I stepped into the hallway, something felt different. The air was heavier, my thoughts tangled. His words echoed in my mind, you can always come to me. They sounded simple, but the way he'd said them carried something more. I pushed open the door to the nearest restroom, letting it swing shut behind me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their brightness stark against the cool tile. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run over my hands, grounding myself. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was still flushed from our conversation. He was just being nice, I told myself. Teachers are supposed to care about their students. And yet, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me. His voice replayed in my mind, calm and steady, making my chest tighten. The bathroom door creaked open. My heart skipped a beat. I turned instinctively, expecting another student, but my breath caught in my throat. Professor Carter. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes meeting mine briefly before stepping further inside. The door closed softly behind him, the faint click of the latch locking into place. "Hey," he said, his voice low but casual. "Didn't mean to startle you." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. The water was still running, the sound filling the otherwise silent room. "I noticed you left in a bit of a hurry," he said, leaning against the wall near the door. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about the way he was looking at me that made the air feel heavier. "Just needed a minute," I replied, my voice unsteady. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've seemed a little off lately," he said after a moment. "Not just today." I balled up the paper towel in my hands. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away. The silence felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I glanced at him through the mirror, and the intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up," he said, taking a slow step closer. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me." I turned to face him fully, gripping the sink's edge for support. "I'm fine," I repeated, though my voice wavered. He took another step forward, his movements careful, deliberate. "You sure?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was an answer to his question or an attempt to convince myself. His gaze softened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been on my mind lately." The words hit me like a jolt. The air between us felt charged, magnetic. His hand reached out, brushing against mine, so lightly, yet sending a shiver through me. "Carter," I whispered, the name feeling unfamiliar yet intimate on my tongue. His lips quirked into a faint smile, but his eyes held something deeper. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. I want you to know I'm here." The sincerity in his voice disarmed me, leaving me vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. And in that moment, I knew, whatever this was between us, it wasn't over. That day with Professor Carter was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. If someone had told me a few weeks ago that I'd find myself caught in a moment like this, I would have laughed. But as I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, I knew that nothing about this was a joke. It all started like any other day. The final bell rang, and the once bustling classroom emptied within minutes. I could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway as students headed home, their voices fading into the distance. The classroom door had been left open, letting in the occasional burst of chatter from the outside world, but in here, everything felt still. I sat at my desk, staring at the worksheet in front of me, but the faint pencil smudges blurred together. My mind was far from the assignment, inevitably drawn to the only other person in the room, Professor Carter. He sat at his desk, sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened as he marked papers with the kind of concentration that made him oblivious to the world around him. His brow furrowed slightly as he scanned the page in front of him, his pen moving in smooth, deliberate strokes. He always carried himself with an effortless kind of confidence, the kind that made it impossible not to notice him. I had never thought much of it before, not in the way I was thinking of it now. But something was different. I wasn't supposed to be here, alone, with him. And yet, I didn't move. I told myself it was because I needed to finish my assignment, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. His voice broke the silence, smooth and steady. Still working on that? I jolted slightly, looking up to find him watching me. Yeah, I replied quickly, straightening my posture. Just a couple more questions. He leaned back in his chair, setting his pen down. His expression was thoughtful, amused even. You're one of the few students who actually takes this seriously, he said. A flicker of warmth spread through me, and I wasn't sure why. I guess I just don't want to fall behind, I shrugged. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me just a little too long. That's a good habit, he murmured. Most people don't realize how much their choices now shape their future. There was something about the way he said it, so earnest, so certain, that sent a strange sensation through me. I gave him a small smile before turning back to my worksheet, but the words on the page seemed to swim before my eyes. For a while, the only sounds were the faint scratch of my pencil and the rustle of papers as he flipped through his assignments. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavier. Then, after a moment, he stood. I'll be right back, he said, stretching slightly as he moved toward the door. Okay, I murmured, my voice softer than I intended. I watched him walk out, the door clicking shut behind him, and let out a slow breath. The room was completely silent now, the absence of his presence more noticeable than it should have been. I tapped my pencil against the desk, my thoughts racing. Why was my chest tight? Why did I feel so restless whenever he looked at me? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. He was just being nice, just doing his job. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, a part of me wasn't convinced. The door opened again, and he stepped back inside. His gaze flickered to me as he moved back to his desk, but he didn't say anything at first. I could feel his presence, his movements deliberate and steady. You're awfully quiet today, he noted. I forced a small smile. I guess I'm just focused. Good, he said, though something in his voice made my stomach twist. I could feel the weight of his attention on me, a quiet intensity that made it impossible to ignore. You don't usually stay this late, he said after a pause. I shrugged. I just wanted to get this done. He nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. You know, he said after a moment, you can always come to me if you need help with anything. The way he said it, it shouldn't have made my breath catch. But it did. I swallowed hard. Thanks, I murmured. His lips quirked into a faint smile before he turned back to his work. But the tension remained. When I finally finished my assignment, I gathered my things, my hands unsteady as I stuffed my papers into my bag. I'll see you tomorrow, I said. Take care, he replied, his voice warm but unreadable. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt it. Something had shifted. And I wasn't sure how to handle it. I barely remembered walking to the restroom, only that I needed a moment to breathe. Inside, I turned on the sink, letting the cool water run over my hands. The sensation grounded me, but only for a second. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was still flushed. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But then the door creaked open, and my breath caught. Professor Carter. He paused, his eyes meeting mine briefly before stepping further inside. The door shut softly behind him. Hey, he said, his voice low but calm. Didn't mean to startle you. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. It's fine, I said quickly, turning back to the sink, hoping he wouldn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly. I noticed you left in a bit of a hurry, he said. His posture relaxed but his gaze lingering. Just needed a minute, I replied. He nodded. Rough day. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He exhaled softly, his expression unreadable. You've seemed off lately, he said finally. Not just today. I balled up the paper towel in my hands, my chest tightening. I'm fine, I said quickly. The silence that followed was thick. When I dared to glance at him through the mirror, the intensity in his eyes made my breath hitch. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him fully, gripping the sink's edge for support. "I'm fine," I repeated, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. His gaze softened. "You've been on my mind lately." The word sent a shock through me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his fingers barely grazing mine. I should have stepped back. I should have said something. But I didn't. And then he said my name. Softly. Intimately. And in that moment, I knew, this wasn't nothing. This wasn't over. And whatever happened next would change everything.